Yu-Gi-Oh! Versus Pokemon, a rivalry as old as time. And recently in the TCG discourse, there was a discussion as to which of the two games is more difficult. So for today's discussion, I have decided to pull in 8-time regional champion and now world's competitor, Azul GG, and we're going to be talking about some card games. Azul, how you doing, my buddy?
I'm doing pretty good. Just came off a win recently in Mexico.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so that was kind of cool. And yeah, I'm excited to be here to talk about some Pokemon, talk about some Yu-Gi-Oh, and just I guess flesh out some thoughts on the games.
For sure. I always love how so nonchalant you're like, yeah, I just won again, whatever, on to the next one. It's great. So we're going to be going through, I've got several topics for us to discuss today, and we're going to just sort of present our own case as to why we think our respective game might be more difficult. We can ask one another questions about each respective game because maybe your audience isn't as familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! My audience may not be as familiar with Pokemon, and let's just have some fun. Let's just talk about some cards. Sound good?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Cool. So I think starting off, we're going to sort of build into the more meaty parts of our game by starting at the more simpler aspects. And I think starting with the actual just win conditions or the objectives of the game in general are probably a good place to start. So for Yu-Gi-Oh!, for anyone who doesn't know, basically both players start with 8,000 life points, and the objective of the game is to get or rather your opponent, I should say, down to 0. And this actually differs quite a bit from Pokemon.
Yeah, so in Pokemon, and Pokemon's like different compared to like every other card game because it involves prize cards, which is at the beginning of the game, you take 6 cards from the top of your deck after you've drawn your hand for turn, and that hand contains a basic Pokemon. If it doesn't, then you mulligan. The mulligan system in Pokemon is pretty different compared to most other card games as well. And then you take 6 cards off the top of your deck once you've established a hand with a basic Pokemon, and you lay those out. And once you've drawn all 6 of your prize cards, I guess it's kind of similar to One Piece now. Actually, One Piece has like a similar prize card mechanic, but you draw your prize cards in One Piece as your opponent like takes them. So it's a little bit different. But in Pokemon, as you take knockouts, you draw your prize cards, and once you have 0 prize cards left, you win the game. There's other ways to win as well, but that's how 99% of games are won, is through prize cards.
Sure, of course. I imagine there's other like alternate win conditions. I mean, I feel like every game has those. But so one of my main questions to you is there a way to sort of in Pokemon like win on the very first turn, or is that impossible?
No, you could, because the other win conditions in Pokemon are benching out your opponent. They have no Pokemon in play. So if you open one Pokemon, like if you go first and you open your Pokemon and you go pass, and I knock out your only Pokemon in play, you lose. So you always have to have a Pokemon.
Is that common?
It's not. I wouldn't say it's not common, but it's not uncommon. Like, I'm trying to think over this weekend, I was playing a pretty aggressive deck this weekend that could take pretty big knockouts on the first turn going second, and I probably only donked like. We call it donking when you knock out someone's only Pokemon in play. I think I only donked like twice. 13 rounds plus 3 top cut rounds. Yeah, it was only 2 or 3 donks. So it doesn't happen that often. And also, you have to be playing a deck that can actually do it. So I was playing a deck that can take some pretty big knockouts on the first turn, but not every deck is going to be able to take those big KOs.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you this. Are you able to... You said you were playing this very aggressive deck. So, and you said even though it can happen, it's still relatively infrequent, especially based off the record that you just said. Are you able to construct a deck in such a way that you could donk your opponent like conceivably every single game? Or is that would the planets just have to align for something like that to happen? Because it's more reliant on your Pokemon or your opponent benching a Pokemon or anything along those lines. Yeah,
and like if you go, there is one combo in the game right now that allows you to do a decent amount of damage on the first turn going first. Because in Pokemon, you can't attack on the first turn going first. But there is there's special conditions in Pokemon which are effects that happen in between turns or at some point during your turn if you're like trying to attack. And poison is one of those special conditions where you take damage in between turns, and there's some modifiers in the game right now. So you can do like 80 damage on your first turn going first, like one deck can. But very often, donks happen on the first turn going second. And to my knowledge, there's only ever been one deck that has ever existed that was basically a donk deck. And I don't know if that deck itself or just kind of how the game was at the time. I did play back then, but I don't really truly remember.
Okay.
But we did have a mid-season rotation around. There was a rule change going into the season, which made the deck all of a sudden become a thing. And you could knock out basically like 2 to 3 Pokemon on the first turn of the game going first. and the deck played a Pokemon that said, if you start this Pokemon, you go first. Like there wasn't even like an option for your opponent to get to go first unless they opened the same Pokemon. So you went first. There was a card called Via Seeker, or not Via Seeker, there's a card called Seeker that you both picked up a Pokemon off your bench. So that would reduce your opponent's potential Pokemon in play by 1. And then you could take up to maybe 2 knockouts with some damage modifier cards. So that deck was maybe the reason for the midseason rotation. It was a pretty toxic deck. And it only came about because of a rule change. But that's the only deck that's ever existed that's basically played for like donking your opponent every single game, no matter what.
Sure. Sure. Interesting. So in contrast that to Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is interesting because I feel like you always hear all the time where Yu-Gi-Oh! Stigmatized, where it's the game where no one ever gets to play, right? There's like 2 ends of the spectrum. There's either no one gets to play because people can, on the very first turn of the game, set up a board that is insurmountable in most cases, unless you draw a specific combination of cards that allows you to what we call breaking the board, if you will. And we'll get into interaction a little bit later, where if you have certain, what we call hand traps to just, kind of stop the opponent mid-combo from building a board like that, that's also a way we have to sort of insulate against that. But similarly, we have, these types of strategies that either build this entire board to have so many negations or ways to interact that the opponent essentially doesn't have a way to play, or we have what are called, FTK decks, first turn kill decks, that if they resolve without being interrupted, or even sometimes through interruption, depending on the way that they function, we can actually just kill the opponent on the very first turn of the game. And the deck is constructed in such a way to do that every single game that it plays. Not at a 100% consistency rate, but at a high enough consistency rate that it'll more often than not go off. And so that's where our ban list comes in, because we're able to have these cards checked and balanced. So that way, okay, these FTK decks, there are still FTKs legal in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but for the most part, the ones that are legal are pretty few and far between, or require the absolute nuts if you're going to actually pull it off, and you're not going to consistently pull it off, and the ones that are consistent enough will eventually get hit on the ban list in some way. So it's interesting to hear that, and I think that's definitely, when it comes to just the overall win conditions of our respective games, it even goes into like, deck building and such, right? That's something you have to take into account. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So in Pokemon, it's like it doesn't come up very often. Like I said, donking doesn't happen that much. And the other win condition is decking out, which also doesn't happen very much. And usually no one like sits there until they actually deck out. It's like, oh, I can't do anything. I know you have me locked, so I'm just going to concede. And then, yeah. So in comparison to Yu-Gi-Oh!, where it's like, it is like, so basically for Pokemon, we did have something like that, but it only ever happened. It was only once in the game, as far as I can remember. If there was anything like that before my time, and it was pretty toxic. But this is like more of a common thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! So that is interesting. But in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's different. I assume, because whenever I hear people talk about Yu-Gi-Oh!, I feel like I see the more negative spectrum of the people talking about Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially whenever they talk about it like in my live stream chat or something like that. Because they're players who are now probably playing Pokemon, so they probably didn't like where Yu-Gi-Oh! Was at when they quit. People talk about like you play like 2 or 3 turns and it's like some big combo and you just lose, right? But
right.
In Yu-Gi-Oh! You can interact on your opponent's turn. I assume that through their whole sequence of this major combo, there's a lot of you having to decide when you're playing your cards in expectation of what your opponent is doing as they build up towards their big combo. Am I wrong with that assumption, or?
No, absolutely. And that's something that I think we'll touch on a little bit later when we get to the interaction section, because I think there's a lot to discuss there, just because our games are a little bit different in that regard. But no, you're not incorrect to think that at all. There's definitely, it's interesting because we do have the ability to interact on the opponent's turn, but what can be difficult, and this is sort of like with the skill barrier with the game, is that even if you have disruptions to be able to stop the combos, there are more ideal or optimal times to use those disruptions than others that can be a lot more impactful and maybe be the nail in that coffin for them to be able to fully execute their combo. And so that's something that players, especially players at the top level, they constantly hone and refine these decks to find ways to even work around these disruptions, that even if they get hit by 1, 2, sometimes 3 interruptions, they're still able to achieve their combo, or at least a decent enough combo by the end of it all, that we only start with 5 cards in hand. The opponent's going to draw 2 6, but they use 3 of those cards to interrupt their opponent, and now they only have 3 cards to work with on their turn to sort of, fight back, if you will. So it's definitely a tug of war in a sense.
Yeah, I have to imagine if what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is what people have sometimes like described it to me as just like one person combos off and the game's over, then no one would play the game. So I always imagine there's a lot of back and forth in that big combo turn of like deciding if you want to play this card or you want to hold it for the a later interaction or hold it for your turn or something like that. So it's hard to so it's not quite the same as Pokemon, because Pokemon there's no interaction. So like even when there was that one and the name of the deck was Sabledonk, for anyone who played back then, and that's all the way back in 2011. So it's a long time ago. We've only ever had one deck that's like comparable, I feel like, to the OTK, right? Is that the term you guys use? One turn FTK decks in Yu-Gi-Oh. We've only ever had one deck I feel like that's comparable to that in the same sense. There is other combo decks that have existed in Pokemon in terms of like Pidgey Control is like a handlock deck that like you sit there and let your opponent like draw 5 prize cards and then you just like lock their board and you just win the game from there. It still takes you like 20 turns to win, but you just like wait until they've drawn enough prize cards and then you lock their hand, lock their board, and then the game's over. So that's like a little bit different. But in terms of like turn 1, turn 2, just win the game decks, I feel like Sabledonk is the only one that's ever existed in Pokemon to that extent. And it's not really, but I feel like it's not comparable either, because in Pokemon, there's no interaction. You just like sat there and let the Sableye donk you. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a ton of like you having to pick how you utilize what you have to try and throw off their combo or be able to survive going into your turn, right?
Sure, absolutely. It's like you said, and I think if there's any takeaway I want people who, might be on the Pokemon side of things to take away from this, is that even though it's true that sometimes in Yu-Gi-Oh there may only be 2 or 3 turns that occur, if you watch high-level tournament gameplay, you'll notice that there's a lot of interaction happening within those few turns.
Yeah.
So in terms of a turn count, there isn't a lot happening. The amount of actions that are taking place within those few turns are actually quite numerous. And sometimes, even if a game might take 20, 25, 30 minutes, there may only be a few turns that take place within that, depending on the format. People know I'm referring to, Tier Element format, for instance, where a single game 1 can last the entire clock that you're allotted for any sort of tournament. So that was not uncommon for that particular format. But I want to put a pin in interaction for now, because I think you and I have a lot to talk about on the interaction front. I think the next thing I want to get into is resource systems, because I think both Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon respectively have like a somewhat unique resource system, just because the way the games are just fundamentally designed. So you can go ahead and start and talk about Pokemon for those who are uninformed.
Yeah, so as far as resources in Pokemon go, it is a little bit deck to deck dependent, but there's the Pokemon themselves, and then there's the 3 evolution stages. There's basic Pokemon, which can be played directly to the bench. There's stage 1 Pokemon that evolve off of basic Pokemon, and there's stage 2 Pokemon that evolve off of stage 1 Pokemon. And you have to wait a turn to get from your basic to your stage 1 to your stage 2. So like time in that sense is a resource. And then there's energy, which are what you use to pull off your attacks. You can only attach 1 energy a turn, but there's a bunch of different forms of energy acceleration in the game. To give you kind of an example of the range of energy acceleration there is, there's a supporter card that says search your deck for 2 different basic energy cards, attach one of them to your Pokemon and put the other one in your hand. It doesn't count as your attachment for turn, so you can still attach for turn, so it accelerates 1 energy into play. But then there's a stage 2 Pokemon that says at any point, whenever you want, attach as many water energy from your hand to anywhere during your turn. So to give you kind of an idea of the range of energy acceleration that exists in the Pokemon TCG, there's as many water energy at any point, and then there's also a supporter card that you can play that gets just 1 energy out of your deck to put it somewhere, plus puts 1 in your hand. And supporter cards you can only play once a turn, to also like kind of give you a better perspective on that as well. And that's like, the card is called Crispin. It is a card that is played in the best deck in the format right now, Dragapult, but it's only played as like a 1 of. Because Dragapult just needs like a little bit of extra energy acceleration to like keep up turn to turn. But the deck that plays the Baxcalibur that can put as much water energy in play as you want, that deck's not very good right now. So that deck's not very good. But yeah, that's the other, like, I guess as far as resources go. And then there's item cards, which are trainer cards, but you can play as many of them as you want throughout your turn. Supporter cards are also trainer cards. You can only play 1 a turn. There's stadium cards, which is a neutral zone in the game, where either player can put the stadium card into the neutral zone, and then that stadium is the stadium in play that both players can utilize. You can't play the same a stadium of the same name. You have to play like a different one with a different name if you want to replace the active stadium. And that's like the resources in Pokemon. It's just like energy, Supporter card's a big one, and then like Pokemon, you need time to evolve your Pokemon into your bigger Pokemon. And there's a couple ways to like cheat around that. Like there's a card, Rare Candy, it's an item card that can take a basic Pokemon to a stage 2 Pokemon, just completely ignoring the stage 1 Pokemon, stuff like that. So but is that a good breakdown for the resources?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, even if we're just taking energy as the fundamental resource, right? Because that is how you're going to be doing all your big plays. But I mean, obviously the item cards, the supporter cards, the stadium cards, they all play a role. And in contrast, Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the game that everyone always says doesn't have a resource system, which is pretty much true. I always like to say that in Yu-Gi-Oh! The cards themselves are the resource. Of course, cards are resources in every card game. But in Yu-Gi-Oh!, because the cards are the only resource, that is why, for instance, card draw in our game is so just heavily frowned upon, is because just having an individual card over the opponent can be a huge advantage, which is why Pot of Greed, for instance, is still banned to this very day, because it literally just gives you an extra card for free. Funny enough, now there's plenty of cards that can actually interact with something like that, where historically that wasn't necessarily the case. But the cards themselves in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are the resource. Of course, life points are also a resource as well, similar to your prize cards. You're probably totally fine at times, losing a prize card or two. And that's, and granted, you have to get your prize cards by actually knocking out opponents. So it's not like a shield system. It's kind of the opposite of that. But we use life points as a resource all the time. But for us, fundamentally, the only real restriction we have in terms of what allows us to play our cards, where in Pokemon you have time kind of gating you in terms of being able to evolve your Pokemon. Your supporter cards can it's only one supporter card per turn, period, if I recall, correct?
Yeah, unless something says otherwise. We've had stuff in the past.
So unless something says, yeah, that's always the exception to the rule, right? So in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the only guardrails we have are what the cards say themselves, because we have what is called a normal summon, which once per turn you can play a monster that's 4 or less stars, either in attack position or face down defense position. Shocker, no one's really putting stuff in face down defense position anymore. It's not 2005. But we have what are also called special summons, which allow you to just get an additional summon per the turn because it's special. And those terms are kind of reversed now, because everyone's special summoning, 20, 30, 40 times a turn sometimes. And that one normal summon is really key at times, but for the most part, because you're able to do so much, because of the fact that the guardrails are so loose a lot of the times with Yu-Gi-Oh! I like to liken Yu-Gi-Oh! to like a fighting game at times, where it's sort of like Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where at any moment you can do as much as you can, if you're able to just understand the way that your cards work and how they combo together. With the only restriction being that cards might say, oh, you can only use this effect once per turn, or this type of effect once per turn, or different things along those lines. So the monsters obviously make up the bulk of the game. We also have the spell cards that supplement that as well. Spell cards sort of just augment you by allowing you to get additional special summons of different types. They might buff up your resources, get you extra cards, for instance. And then trap cards, which have definitely taken a back seat in a lot of ways, because they need to be set face down for a turn before then being used for whatever their respective effect might be. These cards, because of that one turn delayed, because like I mentioned earlier, how Yu-Gi-Oh! Sometimes the games only last a couple turns, that one turn might be enough to make it so that trap cards aren't worth it. And so most of the time, people either relegate them to the side deck, or it's a card that has a condition that says it doesn't have to be played face down first in order to activate. So for instance, we're talking about cards like Infinite Impermanence, Evenly Matched. These are all cards that say you can activate this card from the hand if you control no cards. Which is a very nice perk, because you can still use them and set them face down if you'd like, but on turn 0, for instance, if your opponent's comboing off, you could still activate them from your hand, because at that point in the game, you don't control any cards. And so that flexibility is something that people really look towards. And I think that's something that's really interesting, because not having a resource system for Yu-Gi-Oh! Sort of overwhelms the player at times, because, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, but with Pokemon, because there's sort of this linear, okay, I have a basic Pokemon, and then it's going to go to a stage 1, then it's going to go to a stage 2. There's sort of this charted course of the way the game is going to play out to an extent, right? Where with Yu-Gi-Oh!, because we don't have this resource system necessarily, anytime you look at a opening hand of cards, the amount of possible plays are just almost endless, just really only restricted by how far the deck ceiling is. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, just comparatively.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so like Pokemon, is limited by basically the evolution part of it is the biggest thing. And that's why I didn't like just hone in on energy before, because like yeah, so many different decks operate differently around their energy. Like I said, like the Baxcalibur deck, you could do nothing. You could have 0 energy in play for the first 2 turns, and then you go Candy Baxcalibur turn 3, and then it's like all your energies are in play. So I guess time is like kind of the time in terms of turns. I guess like the first couple turns of the game, building up towards your evolutions is kind of the more important thing. And then in Pokemon as well. But once the turns have been established and then all those options become available to you, that is where in Pokemon it's like the possibilities are kind of similar in Yu-Gi-Oh in terms of like you could do anything at that point.
It just takes a few turns to build to that point.
Yeah. But and then I guess and you can correct me on this one. It's a little bit different in Yu-Gi-Oh because like in Pokemon it's like if you have a 2-card hand, that doesn't really mean that much. It does mean something, and there is hand disruption cards in Pokemon. They're very powerful, and they definitely have effect. But I feel like in Yu-Gi-Oh, if your opponent has a 2-card hand, their options are way more limited than they are in Pokemon, right? Because like you're not going to be able to get up to a 5-6 card hand on that turn. In Pokemon, one of the most powerful draw supporters is Research, discard your hand, draw 7. But the most powerful, I guess like win condition card in the game is also a supporter, Boss's Orders, which brings up one of the bench Pokemon to the active. You can't play both in the same turn, right? So you can't research into your boss, so you have to somehow get to your boss without playing a different draw supporter. So yeah, in Pokemon you can go from a pretty low hand size to still theoretically having all your options on your turn. But yeah, in Yu-Gi-Oh that's different, right? Like if you have a 2-card hand, your opponent can more easily predict what you're going to have available to you in terms of counters as they're playing out their turn or going into the next turn, what they'll be able to do, I assume.
I would push back on that a little bit because, as I mentioned before, Yu-Gi-Oh cards they are the resource. And each Yu-Gi-Oh card, especially as we're in, modern Yu-Gi-Oh or, 2025 Yu-Gi-Oh, each individual card is so powerful. And although our draw power is limited, don't get me wrong, we do have cards that are in the spirit of Pot of Greed to allow us to get additional cards. Pot of Desires, Pot of Extravagance, so on. However, the difference is, the card's advantage isn't accrued necessarily in the hand. Don't get me wrong, there are some decks. For instance, I'm thinking back to the Zodiac era for anyone listening, where there was an opening turn that a single normal summon of one particular Zodiac monster, Zodiac Rapier, ended you on a board with multiple monsters, one of which disrupted your opponent, and one of which would get you an additional draw on the following turn. But you'd also have an additional 6 cards in your hand in addition to your opening hand as well. So you would already be +6 over your opponent with the single resolution normal summon of one particular card. And that was back in 2017. And now with the introduction of all these new cards, because since we're in Eternal format, Yu-Gi-Oh has to constantly keep pumping out more and more powerful cards. The introduction of cards such as Snake Eye Ash, for instance, which is one of the newer cards, very similar. If that card were to resolve, and let's say that combo were to resolve fully, even through interruption, it's not uncommon that the opponent would end on a board that would have multiple ways to interact and negate what the opponent has on their turn. You would have additional cards being able to accrue in hand. So it's not necessarily that it's the resources are accruing in hand. It's more that you're accruing the resources on the board. I guess similar to, you building your bench in Pokemon would be, I guess, the analog here. But with having that interaction during the opponent's turn, that's like a different axis that we have to operate on. But yeah, an individual monster in Yu-Gi-Oh, not even just monster, an individual spell card sometimes, the resolution of that effect, and depending on how many interruptions the opponent may or may not have, that can result in huge amounts of card advantage, because that card will just tutor into the next card, which tutors into the next card, and it just keeps going through the flowchart until ultimately it results in whatever crazy, board that the combo player is able to create at that moment. Yeah. And that sort of gets me to the next topic that I want to discuss is the front loading of information. And I think this is definitely something that Pokemon is really good with when it comes to, everyone always says, Pokemon's a very easy game to pick up, very difficult to master. And I think that's true for a lot of games, but for Pokemon specifically, from my, little understanding of the game thus far. But Yu-Gi-Oh, I've always said, has this exponentially difficult curve if you're trying to learn the game, because there is so much information you have to front load in order to actually just understand the basic mechanics of it. And why don't you go ahead and share your insights on that?
No, yeah, I think it's definitely true. I think Pokemon is the easiest game to pick up for sure. So I don't even think it's close. I don't even think there's a game even close to as easy I think Yu-Gi-Oh might be the toughest of them, although I haven't like tried to play with a Yu-Gi-Oh deck in a long time. Comparing to even the other games, it's yeah, I'd have to like start playing with them again to like compare something to like a One Piece or a Magic or something like that. I've always found Magic to be pretty easy as well, to be honest. The hardest thing about Magic for me is you have to learn the keywords, but once you learn the keywords, it's like I feel like Magic was always pretty easy, but yeah, Pokemon for sure is the easiest of them all, I think, for sure.
Yeah, the keywords are definitely a double-edged sword because that's always a common complaint with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't use keywords, which is both good and bad. It's good because you don't have to know what the keyword means, even though I would say with Magic, a lot of the times if you look at keywords, they're pretty intuitive. At least they were earlier on. Maybe as the game has aged, they've gotten a bit more obscured, but the downside of that with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that, and this is obviously another joke when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh!, is that you look at a card and it has a paragraph of text on it. And so, yes, you don't have to understand any particular keywords, but it comes at the cost of cluttering the card with a novel's worth of text. And especially nowadays, when each card has a novel's worth of text, that's just one of the many barriers when it comes to anyone who wants to enter the game or re-immerse themselves with the game. It's really difficult because that's just step one. And then you have all the different summoning mechanics that the game has. And then there's all the different rules and then the hidden rules and different things along those lines. But I think that's definitely Pokemon's favor, and which is one of the reasons why I'll hear Yu-Gi-Oh players all the time say they pick up Pokemon and they're like, oh, this rocks. Like I picked this up in, you know, because Yu-Gi-Oh's so complex, and they pick up Pokemon. They're like, oh, this is great. It's almost like this mental load that they get to take off because they still get to massage those muscles and, you know, play the game, but it's not nearly having to front load all that information initially. It comes with actually being immersed in the game itself and the strategic aspect of it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I always like was annoying whenever I tried to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like, especially because I played with someone who's like reasonably experienced, and I would like play a card assuming the interaction based on reading the cards, and he was like, no, it actually resolves this way. And I'd be like, that doesn't make any sense based on me reading both of these cards. That was always my most frustrating thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! It's like there was like another, you have to like know so much more. Because like I said, like, when I compare it to like, I feel like Magic is a good comparison because like the only hard thing that whenever I've talked to people about Magic, they always tell me the hardest thing is like the keywords. But it's like once you just know what the keywords do, like you can just read the cards. There is like still like the stack in Magic, which I feel like everyone always overcomplicates. Whenever I've like been having to resolve the stack in Magic, I almost always get it right. So I don't even know. I don't think it's as hard as like people make it out to seem, but that's like the hardest part about Magic is like sometimes resolving the stack of interactions or whatever it is.
And that's because there is that layer of interaction, right, on the opponent's turn. Because in Pokemon, you guys don't have the stack. You know, you play a card, it does the thing. You play the card, it does the thing. Unless I'm misinformed, but I'm pretty sure you don't have anything like that, right?
Yeah, the only thing we have is there's stuff that you can do on your turn. That means your opponent can't do certain things on their turn. And then we had one card back in 2010 that you could play during your opponent's turn, but we haven't had a card since then.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
interesting.
It's been a while. I think we've maybe had one other card since then, but it wasn't good. But the card back then was good. That was a pretty good card. But yeah, we haven't had anything super relevant since 2010 or 20. I guess it was still legal in 2011 until the midseason rotation happened. But
well, that means you're due then for another one.
Maybe we'll see. They're maybe just done with it, to be honest. They just don't maybe want to.
Honestly, I could see that.
Yeah, which I think is fair.
I could see
keeping the game like even a little bit more one-dimensional in terms of that. I don't think it's like a bad thing either. I mean, I wouldn't hate to see something like that come back because it's just cool to see new interactions make their way back into the game.
Of course. Absolutely. It's just a whole different axis to operate on. But that's when it comes to like the front loading of information, though, it's difficult because people always joke about Yu-Gi-Oh! And this is why I like comparing it to a fighting game so much, because a lot of people, when they pick up fighting games, they have to go online and they have to look up all these lists of different combos because the game itself might teach you a few basic combos. But for the most part, if you've never experienced a fighting game and you don't understand the system and the mechanics of how it works, it's a lot easier to go online, look up some forums on what the best combos for a character might be. You practice those maybe in the tutorial mode or whatever, like the solo mode, and then maybe you go online to try to practice those against actual opponents, right? And I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very similar as the game has aged. I will say early on, and I'm not sure what your experience was with actually learning Yu-Gi-Oh!, but earlier on, this wasn't the case in the slightest. It was very much, you know, I do my thing, you know, the opponent does their thing. There might be some trap card interaction on the opponent's turn, but not a ton going on during the opponent's turn. But now it's sort of amalgamized into both players are always playing on both players' turns at almost all intervals of the game. And that's something that people, it appeals to people, which is a good or a bad thing depending on what type of experience that you're looking for, right? That's just like one of the strengths of the game, and weaknesses depending on your perspective. But it's not uncommon, especially now, because so many Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks are essentially combo decks in one form or another that even when new archetypes are released or get discovered, like once we learn what they are from Japan, it's not uncommon to have to look up the combos that people discovered either on YouTube or find some like spreadsheets or different things that people have learned and read these 10, 15, 20, 25 step combos that you have to perform. That is fundamentally the basic combos of a particular deck. And you show that to someone and they don't even want to try, right? Because they're like, oh, fuck this, like I'm not even going to try to learn this game because it's so overwhelming to them, where Pokemon's so new player friendly in that way that's something that really benefits them.
Yeah, that was interesting. I saw that come up a lot with the discussion on Twitter. I didn't really have that realization of Yu-Gi-Oh, but a lot of people talking about like flowcharts and spreadsheets. And I was like, to me, it sounds like it's more like Yu-Gi-Oh is more like almost like playing blackjack or something, like where you just have the tables laid out and it's just like you have to just follow the flow chart. You open with these 5 cards or you open with these 5 cards, you do this. If they counter with this, now you go down this line or whatever. But it does sound like Yu-Gi-Oh, even though it sounds bad, Yu-Gi-Oh sounds like more like one continuous turn. But there's still, it doesn't matter if it's 1 turn or 20 turns. It just matters how much interaction there's back and forth and how much you enjoy how much you enjoy that experience overall is the only thing that really matters. There's a lot of back and forth, but it's just happening in few turns.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that it's better for people to visualize, whether written or sometimes people make these spreadsheets or flowcharts with actual images for people who are more visual. I think it's easier for people to, when they're performing these combos, especially because we have interruptions as well. Because if we didn't have the interruption on the opponent's turn aspect, then it would be very similar to your game where they're going to go through the motions of doing their entire 25, 30 step combo. And then they say, okay, now the opponent gets to do something, right? But because you have interaction, you're introducing this whole other element where as you're performing the combo, if the combo gets interrupted at X, Y, or Z interval, now you have to pivot, and depending on what other cards you have in your hand or what specific interaction the opponent used, because different interactions might say either negate the effect so the monster remains on the field, they might say destroy the monster so the monster is destroyed but the effect still resolves. There's all these different outcomes. And so because, once again, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really have this resource system sort of keeping everything in check, and you're really only limited by what your cards are able to do, I think there's just such an unlimited number of options available to you that I think that's why people resort to making these huge documents. Or sometimes you can even look on YouTube. There's people who have 2 to 3 hour videos just showcasing different combos and how they interact against different types of interaction and such. It's wild, but I think that's one of the reasons why people like the game and why a lot of people don't like the game. And that's just sort of a consequence of how the game has evolved over time. But I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Has sort of leaned into that because it's something that no other game really does. And I think that's to its strength, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, if we're all playing the same game, we'd all just be playing the one that has the biggest prize pool, right? If every game was just Pokemon, then it wouldn't matter. So they got to be different. And people try and do the same thing in Pokemon too, where, I mean, I think it's a little bit annoying. I'll talk to some people and their deck beats everything and this X and Y always happens. And I'm like, but when you sit down and you actually play in a tournament in Pokemon, like that's just not how the game play. I feel like ever. And maybe one of the things is maybe I'm just a little bit less prepared than some of these players are. Because when I talk to some of the better players in the game, they'll break down a matchup for me. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And they make it seem like it happens every single game. But I was like, I don't know. I don't think this happens. I don't think this happens every single game. So like having the idea of like prize trades and like some kind of flow chart of your first couple turns or how you want to approach a matchup is always good, of course, no matter what game you're playing. But
sure,
yeah.
I was gonna say, do you guys have like these like flow charts or spreadsheets? Like even if it's like on a much smaller scale, like is there a defined course of action depending on your deck that you're always gonna follow like these particular steps?
I mean, it's like yes, but I feel like it breaks more often in Pokemon than Yu-Gi-Oh! It does. Like where it's more often that you have to, and that's where the best players in the game in Pokemon thrive is like when it's not about being good at it's not about being good at a deck or being good at a matchup is what I always say. It's about being good at problem solving. Because when a new problem arises in the middle of game 3 on your winning in for day 2, you don't just want to follow the flow chart. You want to recognize when there's a better play, right? So that's like super important to be like, oh, because my opponent had to research away card X and then they didn't hit card Y on turn 2. Now I can make play A over play B, where normally I'd make play B because of those things. But you have to be able to recognize that in the moment. And I'm sure that comes up in Yu-Gi-Oh, but it sounds like it definitely comes up less, and like being, I don't know, I guess like a little bit more trained, which isn't necessarily like a negative thing, is like more important. Like really honing in on, I guess like the flowchart of it all, and like if they do X and I have Y, I do Z, so on and so forth. But that is like a cool part of it as well, because that means like it changes. It's like a different kind of training regimen for Yu-Gi-Oh compared to Pokemon. Different approach.
Yeah, I would definitely say that separates the average players from the great players, because your average players, especially if they're just learning the game, just picking it up, or if they've, they're more casual, they might just go and look up these YouTube combo videos or these spreadsheets, and they might try to follow along. But the difference is the greater players who have the hundreds, thousands of games under their belt, it's like the old saying goes, right? Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right?
Yeah.
And
you still have to
when you're
eventually.
actually... Right. And so when you're actually in the game, and now all of a sudden you've been practicing these combos, and let's say you're practicing without getting interrupted in any way, which is never going to happen when you're in a competitive setting, unless your opponent just doesn't draw any interaction, which is completely, that it's not like it doesn't happen, but it can. Then all of a sudden, these players who are really trying to acclimate with the game, they get interrupted, and now all of a sudden they don't know how to pivot, because it's a combination of they weren't practicing knowing how to get interrupted and what the next follow-up play is, but also because it's not necessarily learning like the game sense itself versus just following what a spreadsheet says. It's two completely different skill sets, at the end of the day. And so it's interesting. And since we're on the topic of everything, this is a lot of the stuff we're talking about is, prior to the game actually taking place, right? I kind of want to talk about like deck building and construction, altogether. So tell me how deck building works in Pokemon, and like how your tournament setting works when you're playing like your best 2 out of 3s. I'm curious about.
Yeah, so no sideboard, no side deck. And the mulligan system in Pokemon works. Well, for setup, I mean, both have a 60 card deck. You sit down, flip a coin. One person roll. Or we usually roll dice. Some people flip coins, but they're weirdos. We roll the die. The other player calls heads or tails. Whoever wins the die roll, and for calling heads and tails with a die roll, it's just evens our heads, odds our tails. Yeah. And then the winner picks first or second. And then
So you can pick first or second.
Yeah.
It's not, I win, I go first no matter what.
That's the way it used to be, actually. Back when I started playing in 2009, whoever won the coin flip went first. Like, you were forced first.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, nowadays you pick first or second, which I definitely like that a little bit more, because if you're bringing a deck that you can actually have an advantage, like if you're bringing a deck in a go second meta or a go first meta that does the opposite.
That's what I was going to ask.
You like being able to take advantage of that kind of stuff is like interesting. We're in a go second meta right now. Yeah, you do that. Loser of the first game picks first or second for game 2, so on and so forth, until one person wins both games. Or if you run out of time plus turns, we play 50 minutes plus 3. If that happens in game 2, the winner of game 1 wins the set. If it happens in game 3, we don't have any tiebreakers in our current rules. There is tiebreakers for top cut, of course, and we've had tiebreakers in the past. But if it's 1-1 and you're in game 3, irrelevant of prize count or anything else, it's a tie. If it's at 1-1 in game 3, yeah. In the past, it was a prize card tiebreaker, but there's an interesting discussion around that, because like that would if it was prize cards, I would favor faster decks over slower decks. Control decks and stall decks would be less good then, of course, as well. So I'm personally currently content with the rules, but yeah, that's like our breakdown for how the tournament plays out. And we play 8 to 9 rounds day 1, 4 to 5 rounds day 2 into asymmetrical top cut. For like deck construction, you want me to go into just like generally how people like build decks and play decks, or what decks they choose to build and play? So it's interesting
on a macro level.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how it goes in Yu-Gi-Oh, so we'll get into that, of course, I'm sure, after this. But in Pokemon, it's interesting. Back when I started playing the game back in 2009, I guess I wasn't really hyper aware very much back then. So a little bit after that, like 2013, 2014, like nobody knew what anyone was playing, and coming up with something new, interesting, and innovative was like actually pretty easy, because the information share was so little. But where we are, like 2015, 2016 is when like the information age of the Pokemon TCG kind of started, thanks to Robin Schultz creating the Limitless TCG website, which just kind of archived all tournament results and deck lists post-tournament. And now we're getting to the point post-COVID where the tournament software, where we go like to register and we get our pairings and stuff. RK9 just publishes everyone's deck list post tournament, like the day after the tournament, and then Robin and other people, like they have back end access or whatever, so they can just instantly upload the list to their websites, and everyone just has access to every deck list that like makes day 2 pretty readily available. So the information age in Pokemon right now, like everyone knows basically what the top decks are. Everyone roughly knows what the decks are playing as well. So it's kind of interesting. We do still see some innovation, like for anyone who like keeps up with the Pokemon TCG, like the Gardevoir lists that we saw in Mexico this last weekend were very interesting with like Triple Monkey Dory and stuff like that. So there's still innovation can happen, and there's still unknown stuff happens. You don't know your opponent's exact 60 once you know what archetype they're playing, but like it's pretty known. Like there's not that much, you're not guessing a whole ton. Like like I don't know, like 56 cards or something like that. Once you know what archetype they're playing, unless it's like a control archetype or something like that, because those are like in general a little bit more weird, a little bit more out there. But like a standard tier 1, tier 2, try and draw 6 prize cards archetype, basically 56 cards once you figure out what archetype they're playing for the most part.
Yeah, I would say Yu-Gi-Oh! Is similar in a lot of ways, especially with what you described about the information age, right? In the old days, no one really knew anything.
Yeah.
We did have websites such as metagame.com, Pojo, if anyone remembers Pojo.
I actually know that name. I don't know why I know that name.
Yeah. Usually, like, people have heard of these names. And so there are some archives that were available, but for the most part, it was pretty limiting. I do remember even, too, they'd sometimes publish different deck lists and stuff in, like, Beckett Magazine and some of the magazines that would talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! And other card games. But yeah, similar to what you were describing, eventually there was this renaissance, and YouTube, I think, definitely played a big role in that, because for the longest time prior to like Yu-Gi-Oh! Content creation sort of becoming what it is now, where it's very like episodic, like almost like Netflix style of series, that you see. A lot of it was very much focused on just like primarily showing off like different deck profiles and just going to events and showing off tournament results. And there were very few places that were chronicling all this information. But then as the years went by, slowly we started to see these websites form that were chronicling all the information. So that way there was the ease of availability for a lot of people to access it. And I think that slowly like brought up the average skill of the player base, because now they have all this information available to them, which at the same time also benefited the best players because they were able to take that information. And so similar to what you're saying, when you're sitting across from an opponent in a particular metagame, once you see them play their first card, more often than not, you're going to know what deck they're playing, and you probably know about 3/4 to 4/5 of their deck, I would say. And then that's where there's room for innovation, because maybe there's particular cards that are good in a certain meta that other people haven't caught on to, and so on, right? But I think where we differ is especially like the deck building itself, because different from a lot of games, and this is another thing that can sometimes scare people away from Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that we not only have a main deck, we also have a side deck, but then we also have the extra deck. So prior to even playing a game, you need to assemble 3 different decks of cards to bring to battle with you, right? Our main deck is comprised of anywhere between 40 and 60 cards, and that may sound crazy to you, thinking, why would you ever want to play more than 40 from a consistency perspective? In recent years, there has been innovations in the space. Well, first of all, there were cards that were released that incentivize you to play 60 cards in the deck. There was a card, for instance, called That Grass Looks Greener. That card says you count your deck, you count your opponent's deck, and then you mill cards based on the difference between your deck counts. So hypothetically, if you have a deck of 50 cards and your opponent has a deck of 30 cards, you mill 20. And by Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards, that's insane, because like the graveyard is basically a second hand. So you can imagine how that went. But it was interesting from a deck building perspective, because there was never an incentive to play over 40. This sort of changed because then the greater minds of the game started realizing mathematically you're allowed to have 3 copies of a card at max in your deck. People started realizing that if you tinker with the numbers, we have some cards that we want to play in our deck that would be considered dead cards that don't really do anything, but their inclusion in the deck bolsters or enables you to play a very powerful card. The card I'm thinking of, for instance, is a Brilliant Fusion. This is a card that is an extremely powerful card. It's still banned, as a matter of fact. And on resolution, that would allow you to do a lot of really crazy things. It would give you an additional normal summon, for instance, which, you only get 1 normal summon. So the fact this gave you an additional one was absurd. And so you have to play a bad card in your deck in order to facilitate this very powerful card. But you only need to play one of the bad card, and you can play 3 of the really good card. So there's a lot of these interesting deck building decisions of if we play a certain number of cards, the way the math worked out is that maybe sometimes 43 is the right number because you're maximizing seeing the good card and minimizing seeing the bad card. So there's a lot of like really interesting deck building decisions, the way that Yu-Gi-Oh has been designed as a result of that. But that's just all the main deck, right? You said that in Pokemon, you don't even have sideboarding. So we have to then focus on creating a side deck, and the side deck has to give us all of our options to deal with whatever other decks are in a particular metagame. And for the most part, I would say, unless you're specifically in a tier 0 metagame where there's only like one other good deck that is like the best deck, you know, you're going to be facing down probably roughly, I would say like 3 to 4 other meta tier 1 strategies, and maybe you might encounter some rogue decks on your way to top cut, but you need to have those 15 cards prepared that you can side deck in between games of your match. And then the extra deck is something that's completely unique to Yu-Gi-Oh! That a couple of other games have sort of taken inspiration from. I would say like Digimon, for instance, has, you know, the little eggs and stuff that's sort of like an extra deck. Grand Archive is another game that has sort of like an extra deck. Several other games take advantage of it. But in any case, the extra deck is 15 additional cards that just sort of sit off to the side that at any moment, if you meet the conditions to summon one of these monsters from this pile of 15, you're able to perform that particular summon with all the different summoning mechanics that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has. I'm talking about Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, etc. There's like 7 of them. And so that's another 15 cards you have to account for. So at minimum, you need to bring 70 cards in 3 different piles just to even play a game in the first place. And with us being in an eternal format compared to Pokemon, which I believe has set rotation, then the card pool is so vast. And even though we have 10,000 plus cards, you're not going to have to consider every single one of them. You know, the pool is going to be pretty well defined of what's good and what's not. But the fact that you have all these options to you, it can be really overwhelming for a lot of people when constructing these decks.
I'm actually curious. Yeah, definitely. And is the extra deck, how much is that just kind of... my assumption is it's a pretty big part of your main strategy, your extra deck is, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it's not just like,
So
it's not just like, oh, I got this really cool combo. I got lucky to get this combo. I get like a treat. I get one of my cards from my extra deck, but it's like not that big of a deal.
No.
I assume it's like
not
pretty
at all.
integral to your overall strategy.
Absolutely. So I would say initially when Yu-Gi-Oh! First started off and only fusion summoning was the only extra deck mechanic, so much so it was called the fusion deck before they changed it to the extra deck. Back then, that was probably the case. There were a few cards, for instance, called, like Magical Scientist. You could pay 1,000 life points to summon a fusion monster out of your fusion deck for free. So you had this little toolbox available to you. And so that's a good way to think about it, is the extra deck is a toolbox where either it is integral to your main strategy in terms of that's going to be, kind of just kicking your whole deck into gear and getting it going. Or sometimes it's a toolbox where, depending on the circumstances, and maybe there's a particular card that your opponent has that you need like a specific weird out for, you might have that in your extra deck, for instance. So it's a Swiss Army knife that you have access to throughout the entire game that really, I think, just adds this unique layer to the game that no other game has really replicated, at least in my experience.
I'm curious then, for your sideboard deck, is it possible are most of the cards in the sideboard like effective text for matchups, right?
Sure. Sure. So
is it ever possible that you'd make a really bad read on the meta and you make it to top cut without sideboarding a single card? Is that reasonable or no?
I would say that's highly unlikely. I don't want to say that it has never happened, but typically when you're looking at your main deck and you're going up against a particular deck, let's say it's a deck that you aren't really prepared to see. It's some sort of rogue strategy that made its way into the top cut, right? Typically, there's going to be some cards in your main deck that are going to be bad in that matchup that maybe the cards in your side deck aren't ideal, but they might be marginally better than the cards you'd be siding out. So you kind of make the best with what you have in that type of situation. But recently, for instance, the most recent YCS that just took place in Birmingham with like 2,600 players, a deck that would be considered a rogue deck, Fire King, which historically was one of the strongest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but through power creep and, hits on the ban list and stuff, it's kind of fallen down to being a rogue contender. This deck actually won the entire event because, looking at the rest of the field, it played in such a way that most people's side decks didn't have any answers that were effective against the strategy. And so, especially going into games 2 and 3, when the Fire King player has their entire side deck prepared to beat the top meta decks, not that the deck is bad by any stretch of the imagination, just something that would catch people off guard. They would be really equipped to be able to combat against the top decks at this point, which are Ryzeal and Malice, so that their games 2 and 3 are incredibly favorable. The player himself even said game 1, sometimes it's not favorable for him, but then once it goes to games 2 and 3, he feels really good because he has all of his anti-Malice cards, anti-Ryzeal cards in his main deck now, and the opponent doesn't really have anything to deal with his deck because it's just this sort of off-the-wall deck that people weren't really accounting for.
How does that, I'm curious, and because of that interaction that happened with winning the tournament, how does that going to impact the meta moving forward? Is it just going to, people's side decks are going to change and it becomes a bad deck again, or...
I think it was a result of the player himself being very good. It wasn't just that the deck was good. The player had won previous YCSs before, or has topped multiple YCSs before. So it was both the deck choice, but also the player. It was an instance where a lot of people are going to look at this tournament and see that that deck won. I think they're going to maybe quickly realize that it's a lot harder than it might seem, especially because one of the premier meta decks has in main deck cards that can sort of counter this particular strategy, but it's only a specific card that they play as a 3 of. However, it's situational. Sometimes it can affect the meta and tilt it in such a way, but if people know that it's a rogue strategy and not necessarily a fluke, but something that's more of like, oh, this really strong player took this rogue strategy and ended up winning, the better players might understand that it's something that is not going to be easy to replicate, if that makes sense. And so some players might identify that and say, okay, maybe I'll throw a couple cards in my side deck in case I encounter this matchup because there's going to be a spike in popularity of this strategy. Other players might write it off and say, you know, that's great that they won, but I'm not going to expect to play against this deck because it's more likely I'm going to play against these other 2 decks, 14 out of my 16 rounds in any given tournament, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, as far as like, I was trying to like fully understand understand like teching a little bit more in Yu-Gi-Oh for sure. Yeah, because like in Pokemon, there are tech cards for matchups, but yeah, obviously we don't have a side deck, so you have to choose to include them. But that choice is a lot. It feels worse to just be like, well, am I teching for this one deck? I guess I am. Of course, it depends on how popular it is. Like recently at the last tournament, one deck, the Dragapult deck that I mentioned, which is probably the best deck in the format right now, it was like 18% of the meta, I think. So like putting a tech card in for Dragapult, it's pretty reasonable. But there's some other matchups, like a card that I didn't play that's been pretty popular in Miraidon, which is the deck that I used to win, is Zapdos, which is a tech card for the Archaludon matchup more so than anything. But I chose to not play it because I was like, I don't think Archaludon's that good, and I especially don't expect it to be successful. I think it'll still probably be decently popular, like 6-7% meta deck, but I don't think it's going to be successful at all. And the Zapdos card isn't bad in general. It's just like specifically good in that matchup. But I was like, I'm just not going to include it because I don't think it's going to do, Archaludon's not going to do well enough. So, yeah. I mean, I definitely am. It's not something I long for, but I wouldn't like. It's not something I would be against either. If they were just like, all right, you have a. But in Pokemon, it'd have to be like a 2-card, 3-card sideboard. It couldn't be like 15. It'd have to be pretty small because tech cards are super impactful in Pokemon for sure. So it'd have to be a pretty small sideboard. I wouldn't be against the idea of it, but it doesn't feel something that like it's necessary. Like we don't need some drastic change like that. So I'm pretty content with the way things are personally. But
you don't feel like there are any matches that if you run across them, whether they're let's say they're like you go into a tournament with a particular deck and say you encounter this rogue deck that is like a 90-10 matchup in the rogue deck's favor. Like in those instances, you don't feel like you wish you had a side deck to have something to combat. But I guess if it's a rogue deck, you wouldn't really be accounting for it in your side deck anyway.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there would be some
interesting.
There would be some other strategies where of like lower meta percentage decks, like 5% meta decks, where you'd all of a sudden maybe include a tech card for them. I mean, in the moment, I would want it, but also I have to think on the flip side of that is like if I'm ever bringing a less known strategy, then now my opponent gets to play X card to counter me, and then it kind of takes away from the good meta call that you maybe made. It's a little bit different in something like Yu-Gi-Oh, where you have like you have a 15 card side deck. So I assume, especially when you're playing like a more unknown strategy, some of your side deck cards, I assume, are literally just to counter other people's side deck cards, right? Like against like the top tier meta decks. You're You're just like, well, I know they're going to be playing card X, so I have to put card Y in my sideboard. So game 1, I beat them, and then I bring in my cards to beat their cards that I know they're going to bring.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's part of the mind game when it comes to sideboarding. But then also, similar to Pokemon, I forgot to touch on this, but you are able to pick whether or not you go first or second. And there are some instances where part of the strategy that some players or teams commit to is even if the ideal play, let's say we're in a particular metagame where going first is the norm, there might be some instances where players adapt their sideboards, and let's say they lose the first game. They know that their opponent is going to specifically sideboard in all these cards for going second. So then the player who lost is going to go second because they know that all of the going first cards aren't in the side deck, which are going to be these silver bullets to try to ice them out. So now they're looking at all these cards that are only really good for when they go second versus going first, which gives that player a huge edge in the second or third game, depending on when they did that. And so that's a whole nother layer of strategy as well that a lot of people have adopted, which is a really cool dynamic, I feel.
Yeah, and then it makes, if they get to game 3, that makes game 3 super interesting because now it's on the other foot. It's like, I just did this to you, now you have to predict if I'm going to do it again or not.
Exactly. But I definitely feel like it's part of the strategy you decide prior to, bringing that deck to a tournament. It's not something you're going to pick on the fly to do. You're going to put specific cards in your side deck that are going to match that strategy, I will say. But that's not uncommon in the slightest. And similar to Pokemon, we have had instances where we've had going second metas as well, where you win the initial die roll and you actually want to go second because it's more advantageous for you to do so. In Yu-Gi-Oh, you both draw to 5 at the start of the game. The person who goes first doesn't draw. You actually used to prior to a rule change, thankfully. And now, so if you go second, not only do you get an extra card, which, like I said, in Yu-Gi-Oh is huge, having one extra card over the opponent, but you also get to make the first attack. And since in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can put your opponent down from 8,000 to 0 in a singular battle phase, depending on the metagame and the way that the decks shape up, going second is sometimes ideal. And so, yeah, a lot of fun mind games with the side deck for sure. And what's even crazier is I've talked about the extra deck. You can even side deck extra deck cards. So you could have a few of these cards, these extra deck cards in your side deck for particular matchups. During the sideboarding process, instead of putting these cards into your main deck, you would actually put them into the extra deck and swap out an extra deck card. And this is really cool because since your extra deck is a toolbox that you can access at any given moment, assuming you meet whatever requirements to summon these monsters, it's actually a lot easier for you to take advantage of these cards because you don't have to draw them or search them with your main deck cards. They're always available to you in the extra deck. You just have to meet whatever conditions there are to summon that monster to the field. So that's happened plenty of times as well, where you might see 1 or 2 extra deck cards being sideboarded because against X, Y, or Z matchup, they're just like, they will absolutely just cripple the opponent's ability to play.
Your extra deck has to only be monsters. You can't have spells or anything in there, I assume, right?
Correct. Yeah, the extra deck is only monsters. Yeah, there's, yes, for the purposes of this, yes. There is a type of monster that is a monster and a spell, but we're not going to get into that because that's out of the scope of this video. But interesting, though. That's interesting. I guess that sort of just gets into now where I want to discuss like gameplay mechanics generally. And I think I'll start with this here because I'm not sure if Pokemon does anything like this, and you can correct me if it does. But one of the interesting elements that was in Yu-Gi-Oh! From the start, but they never really started to really lean into until later. I want to say this is probably post Code of the Duelist, once we got Link monsters introduced for people listening, was zone placement. So in case you don't know, a board for Yu-Gi-Oh! You have 5 monster zones and 5 spell and trap zones. And then above the 2nd and 4th monster zones, there's what's called the extra monster zone. And this is a zone specifically for monsters to come out of the extra deck. Certain monsters can go in different areas in these zones, and I'm not really going to get into that. But the placement of your cards in these 5 zones, or those 2 extra monster zones that I mentioned, actually matters quite significantly. Early on, it didn't matter at all. You could just play stuff wherever, but you always had a maximum of 5, and that hasn't changed. It was, I think, Cyber Dark Impact was the set where they released these cards that interacted with the zones, and they were very bad, and no one ever played them, and that was the last time you ever really heard anything of them. But then later on, they sort of reintroduced zones mattering, and so there are cards, for instance, I mentioned one earlier, Infinite Impermanence. So again, imagine there are these 5, different columns for your 5 different spells and traps and 5 monsters. They're all aligned. Infinite Impermanence is a card that reads, target a monster your opponent controls, negate its effect. That can be activated from the hand if you control no cards, which is really powerful, but you can set it face down just like a regular trap card. If Infinite Impermanence is activated while it was face down, so this doesn't work if you just play it from the hand, but if it was activated while it was set face down, every card in that column will also be negated until the end of the turn. So this adds a really strategic element, because if your opponent has a spell card or a trap card across from your Infinite Impermanence, now all of a sudden you can negate that card in addition to the card that Infinite Impermanence would be choosing to negate as well. So it's sort of like this added 2-for-1 value because you played your cards in a particular column. There's another archetype of cards called Mech Knights. Mech Knights are able to be freely special summoned as long as there are 2 or more cards in a given column, your cards and your opponent's cards. So people would place their cards in a specific way so that they build these columns so that they can play these guys out for the field for free. And that would encourage people to sort of play their cards in these weird, funny ways to like avoid making columns of 2 or more cards. So it looked very weird when you would watch people play the game. But a lot of interesting interactions there. And the implications of this are that depending on when you're performing certain combos or playing certain decks, if you put your cards in an inoptimal location, that can sometimes hinder your ability to continue comboing because it needs to be played in a certain spot. And sometimes the opponent can have cards that can disrupt these like column positioning placements as well. So not only do you have to know what all of your cards do, you now have to account for where they are positionally located on the board, almost like Risk or like a battlefield, right? Where you need to like make sure they're in the proper location. Otherwise, they're not going to work as intended, if you will.
That makes sense. Yeah. Pokemon doesn't have anything quite like that.
That's probably for the better, to be honest.
We have
do you have any like sort of adjacent mechanics or anything that relates to positioning, or no? Is that just not even a thing?
The only positioning that matters is the active Pokemon and bench Pokemon. That's it. So for Pokemon, you have 5 bench spots and then the active spot. And the active Pokemon is what is just like neutrally attacked. If an attack says for 2 fire energy, do 100 damage, it's doing 100 damage to the active Pokemon. But then you have attacks that say like one of the best cards in a while that people have been playing for a while. It's not super relevant right now. Radiant Greninja says this attack does 90 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. So it could be the active and a bench, 2 bench, whatever. So you have stuff like that. And then currently we have a stadium card in format. We've had a stadium card in the past that does this, but it expands your bench to 8. So that's that's
kind of cool.
That's if you have a Terra Pokemon in play, then you can have access to 8 bench Pokemon. In the past, we had a card called Skyfield that just said both players have 8 bench Pokemon. But the new one is...
But this one's one-sided.
No, it's 2-sided, but if either of you have... If you have a Terra Pokemon in play, you have access to 8 bench Pokemon.
I see.
Yeah, stadium cards
so that
are
is
always
reciprocal.
2-sided. Yeah. And then besides that, they active spot, bench spot, and then the only other zones, like I mentioned, the stadium zone, like you and your opponent share that, and you both get advantage of the stadium card that is played. And then there's just the lost zone as well, which is a zone that comes in and out of the game. It's kind of like the, every other game has something like this.
Like the banish or exile.
Yeah, banish or exiled. So you can't interact with it. Once a card goes there, it's done. Although is that true? And is there any way to interact with is it exiled in Yu-Gi-Oh?
It exiles magic. We're banished.
Okay.
Unlike other games, cards, the banished pile is a third hand. And funny you say that, because one of the best current decks, Malice, interacts from the banished pile. So one of the best cards for combating this strategy is actually a card called Artifact Lancia, which says neither player can banish cards. So
okay.
if you throw that, it's a hand trap too, so you can play it on turn 0 at any point. It just says discard this card for the rest of the turn, neither player can banish cards. For instance, when these Malice cards get banished, they have the ability that you can then special summon them from the banished zone. So our banished pile is another graveyard, if you will. For a while, it was like that, where pretty much if stuff got banished, you weren't touching it. But yeah, as the game has evolved, the banished pile is just equally as bad as the graveyard in a lot of instances.
They just keep adding more and more. I do kind of like that about Pokemon. I think a lot of that has to do probably with, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more later, with rotation, is that they don't have to worry about constant interactions, and stuff can kind of go away and come back in Pokemon. which is kind of nice. So, and people have talked about, like, in the Pokemon TCGs, like, should there be a card that interacts in the Lost Zone? It's like, probably not. The Lost Zone should probably just be the Lost Zone, and you should, like, it should be a zone that is uninteractable with, and that should be the idea behind it. And then the discard pile is like, you know, something's there, and if there are cards that interact with the discard pile, but yeah, the Lost Zone should probably just not be able to be interacted with. That should probably be the purpose of that zone. Otherwise, the card should be built around the discard pile.
Sure, and that's interesting, though, because that's like another layer of complexity for Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Because it's like, since people can interact with the banished zone, one of the oldest cards that did interact with the banished zone, which is really when they sort of went all in on the banishing mechanic as a concept, a lot of the cards would say, oh, banish these types of monsters to summon a big guy. So that was your payoff, right? But then there was a card, it's still banned to this day and is never going to get unbanned, called Dimension Fusion. Dimension Fusion says pay 2,000 life points. Both players special summon every banished monster, as many as possible. But it's one-sided if you go first and you banish a bunch of monsters and your opponent hasn't gotten to play yet. You Dimension Fusion, you get to summon 5 guys, and your opponent doesn't get to summon any. So there were actually several combo decks built around this dynamic, you know, called like Reasoning Gate decks and such, where they would just try to banish a bunch of cards, Dimension Fusion them out, and just attack for game because they get to cheat out a bunch of big guys really quickly. But that card's very banned for the reason that I said, that the banished pile is still very used in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that card is way too... Any card that says special summon 5 things should probably not be in the game.
Yeah, I will say for Pokemon, for the Lost Zone, there's not... You can't interact with the cards, but, like, currently there's Lost Zone decks, and it's like, if you have 4 cards in the Lost Zone, you get access to X. If you have 7 cards...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So it's more like a threshold type thing, where it's like, you want to get cards there to get some other benefit from it.
It basically just works off of count of stuff in the Lost Zone, but yeah, you can't interact with the cards, you can't use them.
It's not bringing them back, though. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, not bringing them back, or being like, you can use the attack of a Pokemon in the Lost Zone or something like that. Although, hold on.
Well, I think this...
There actually was a Pokemon that used to do that. Yeah, we used to have that Mew Prime back in 2012. Yeah.
This felt like a very Mew/Mewtwo type effect, for what it's worth.
Yeah, but like currently we have the Lost Zone decks where it works off like counts of cards in the Lost Zone, 4, 7, 10, and then before that we had a deck called Lost March, which said for each Lost March Pokemon in your Lost Zone, it does like 20 damage times them or something. So yeah, but it's never like, you know, play a item card that takes a supporter from your Lost Zone and puts it back in your hand or something like that.
And so similarly along those lines, since we're talking about like gameplay mechanics, things like that, we're sort of like in the meat of the games themselves now. I'm curious about information tracking when it comes to Pokemon and some of the rules around this. So for Yu-Gi-Oh, you're not allowed to, for instance, like write anything down. The only thing you're allowed to write down or track, I should say, is if you're tracking the types of effects on monsters you've activated, because maybe you're playing a sort of combo deck that is going to go through a lot of loops, or a lot of hoops rather, not loops. Go through a lot of hoops that you want to make sure some monsters might say, similar to a supporter card, you can only use this effect once per turn. And so you might write down, okay, I use this effect of this monster, and sometimes the cards look very similar too, so that could be a bit confusing. So that's really the only thing you're allowed to track in writing. But for instance, if there's a card that lets you reveal my hand and look at it, you're not allowed to like write down the contents of my hand. If I have play cards that, let's say, add different cards from deck to hand, because anytime you do that, you have to reveal it to your opponent unless the card says otherwise, you're not allowed to write down those cards that I'm revealing so that you're tracking that those cards are in my hand. So you have to just remember all of that. Where does Pokemon fall in that rule?
So Pokemon, you can literally write down anything you...
That's insane.
But it has to be done in a timely fashion. Like, you can't take too long. So the big one that everyone does is they write down their prize cards. So you can't... And this is like a hotly debated topic, or has been in the past, whether or not you should just be able to look at your prize cards and then like shuffle them and then just find them that way. Because what people do is they play their first search card of their turn, like an Ultra Ball or a Nest Ball to go to Pokemon, and then you have access to your whole deck. You have access to the information of what's on the board, what's in your hand, so you can decipher what's in your prize cards, right? So players will take their time to figure that out. And there's like an unwritten rule that is like, you do get a little bit extra time to try and find your prize cards on your first search. And it's like, it is enforced. Is it like, by the...
when you say unwritten, what do you like? Is it sort of like a gentleman's agreement that people just like are okay with that, or what do you mean?
Well, if that was the case, then there would be people calling judges, but it's like even the tournament staff is in on the gentleman's agreement, basically. Like, it's not in the rule book, but like the judges are lenient on the first search, basically.
Okay.
So yeah, it's like
I've also heard too that people will sometimes play mismatched copies of cards to help them quickly more identify which cards are prized. Is that true?
Yeah, like some people will play like all their one-ofs. They'll make them all gold cards and stuff like that. To make it
That's
kind
of cool though. Like, because I mean, I would say people probably hate mismatching just generally, but the fact that it's sort of beneficial for you to do so in that case is kind of funny.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there's like a lot of little tricks that people do, and then another hotly debated, or there was a debate around, like, people will like effectively sort their deck on their first search just to make it, they're trying to be as fast as possible finding their prize cards. So they'll put all their Pokemon in the front of their deck, they'll put all the energy in the back of their deck as they're passing through it, then they'll check the Pokemon, check the energy, check some trainer cards, try and get all 6. Usually most people end, I think, with like 3 to 5, and then they'll go with that, and they'll try and piece the rest together later on. Or at least that's what I usually come up with, is like 3 to 5, and then piece them together as the game progresses. Try and find all the important stuff, of course.
Sure.
Although I am definitely an advocate for just look at the 6 cards, shuffle them, and then just write them down. But that's the main thing that people write down.
Now let me ask you.
Go ahead.
Is there an instance, and this is going to sound dumb to anyone who actually knows Pokemon, but if a particular, this might be also strategy dependent, if a particular card or cards get prized, does that actually like completely thwart some decks from like functioning as they need to?
Yeah, it could. Like, I feel like the one that most people would get if they play Pokemon is Double Guardy EX being prized. I feel like that's the big one that comes to mind, because that's your whole, the deck only plays 2. Because you could play up to 4, but there's just no reason to play more than 2. It would be super overkill. But it's the whole deck is based off energy acceleration through Guardy EX. So if you prize both, your deck just basically doesn't function. Or it'd be the same thing with like the Baxcalibur deck that I mentioned earlier. That deck also plays only 2 Baxcalibur, so if you prize both your Baxcalibur, you kind of just lose.
That's interesting, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a very similar concept. I mentioned before about that Brilliant Fusion, where you're playing this big payoff card, but you have to play like one bad card in your deck to facilitate it. There's a similar concept. We call that bad card, we call those garnets, because the card that goes along with Brilliant Fusion is called Gem Knight Garnet. And so anytime people have to play this sort of 3-1 ratio of really insane borderline banned card to unplayable garbage that you have to play to facilitate the good card, we call those garnets. And so similarly, if you draw the garnet in your hand, the other cards are typically completely dead, because you have to most likely send the card from your deck to the graveyard as part of the effect. And so if it's in your hand, you literally just can't play with that card. And a lot of strategies will, similarly to what you're describing, will crumble as a result of that. Not completely, but it definitely hinders how crazy the deck can perform as a result. And so sometimes people will play a second garnet, even though it's not optimal to do so, because then you're like increasing the chances you're going to draw one in your opening hand. But if you draw one, at least you still have a second in your deck to resolve like the big payoff card. So it's really funny that both games have that like similar dynamic, just sort of like just different mechanically how it works.
Yeah. It's just like the unfortunate odds sometimes, but like almost never, like in a tournament run, it'll probably happen 0 times, and it's like it doesn't really ever affect the outcome of like, you know, the better player winning the majority of the time.
Sure. And I imagine it's so unlikely to happen. Like it may happen like one over the course of, you know, hundreds of games, but that's variance, right? That's any card game.
Yeah. And the way to correctly think about it is that like you and everyone else in the room at the tournament will have equally poor variance for prize cards. It's like whoever can play around it better is the ones who are going to come out on top, right? So the best players in the game, when they prize something, even if it's not something as crazy as double Gardevoir prize, but if they prize like a one of Pokemon that is good for the matchup or scenario they're in, you know, they'll tackle that situation better than anyone else, and they'll probably still come out with the win despite having the unfortunate prize card. In Pokemon, I basically only write down my prize cards. The only other thing that I ever write down is if my opponent plays like a weird count of something, and I recognize that. But I see some people go pretty far their way. Like people will write down their opponent's hand if they play a card that lets them see their opponent's hand. They'll write down their hand before it gets shuffled back. Like, so we play a card in the main disruption card in the format is Iono. Both players shuffle their hands and they put them on the bottom of the deck, and then they draw cards for equal to the number of prize cards they have remaining. So because your hand's going to the bottom of your deck, that's information to work with, right? You know where those cards are. They're like, if you have a 5-card hand, all those 5 cards are somewhere in the bottom 5. So some people like write down their hand before it gets Iono'd. Everyone always takes like a second look at their hand, usually before it gets Iono'd, just so they know if they want to like potentially shuffle their deck before they draw cards or not, of course. And then, yeah, so you can write down literally anything in Pokemon. It just has to be done in a timely fashion. But then,
would you be bent out of shape if you couldn't write stuff down?
Not really, although it's kind of annoying. It would be annoying to not be able to write down my prize cards. That'd be the only one I would like actually care about. Like if we were limited to the only thing you can write down is your prize cards, I think everyone would be fine with that. But I think the second one that most people do is like the one that I do as well, which is when you try and track counts of cards by like writing down, okay, they've played 2 bosses orders so far. I'm definitely gonna make note of, like, you make note of like the big ones to keep track of would be like counter catcher count, bosses orders count, hand disruption count in some decks, stuff like that. There's like the big impact cards throughout a game. So knowing if your opponent plays 2 or 3 bosses orders could be a really big deal if you can figure out that count going into like game 2, game 3, whatever it might be. So but I don't think anyone would be super pressed if they said the only thing you can write down is your prize card. I think people would be fine with that. But
okay, interesting. Yeah, no, with Yu-Gi-Oh, you just have to. You just got to remember it all. That's this part of the way that our game functions. I don't know if there was ever a time where, like, way back in the day, you were able to write down stuff, because I may have covered this with you before, but hand knowledge in Yu-Gi-Oh is like a cardinal sin. You don't mess with the opponent's hand. Most cards that either reveal the hand or interact with the hand to like discard cards, add them and such, are either banned or you just don't touch the hand. You just don't do it. And so back in the day, like, there was a lot of those cards that were legal and are now banned and will never come off the ban list. And so I was so young back then that I'm not sure at a high competitive level if that was ever permitted. I'm sure someone down in the comments can let me know. But yeah, for the majority of my career, that's just, you're not allowed to, like I said, because some cards in particular, you just want to make sure you're not using the effect multiple times, because that can be very game determinative. Or sometimes because cards just have, especially as Yu-Gi-Oh has aged, and I know this is, definitely different from Pokemon, but some cards just have 3 or 4 different effects built into them that sometimes there's just so much going on. That's it. That's really all we get to work with. And even then, some people don't even, we just don't have much to work with. I remember there was a meme going around that someone made a Guess Who board with Yu-Gi-Oh cards in like the little tiles that you knock down. So that way, like when they were playing, they could just like, did you?
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty smart, actually.
Yeah.
That's pretty clever. I'm not sure if like the judges said anything about it, but I thought it was funny.
I don't know if you'd be allowed to bring that on. I mean, I guess I don't know how much space. Pokemon tournaments, we have a lot of space at our tables. And I remember back in the day, we were super cramped on our tables, but they've been giving us a lot of space at our tables recently at our majors.
It depends on the venue.
Yeah.
I feel like. I think some places you have a lot of room, and some places you're like shoulder to shoulder, and it can be uncomfortable. But I'd say at the larger tournaments, you typically have a lot more room. The regional tournament, our regionals are considered our our YCSs are the equivalent of your regionals. So regionals are like one step down, from my understanding. And so those can be pretty cramped because those are a lot in much smaller venues comparatively. Yeah. I want to get into the thing that everyone's probably looking forward to us talking about, and that is interaction. This is maybe one of the biggest, most divisive elements of our respective games. And I think this is an interesting talk because both of our games have interaction, but the interaction and the skills of the interaction just present themselves in separate ways, I feel like. So do you want to start off with Pokemon?
Yeah. So, I mean, in Pokemon, everything is... you can't do anything during your opponent's turn. Like I said, there was one card that existed a long time ago. So everything is like preemptive. You're like playing around, this is always funny when people bring up this as like the reason. I guess like I didn't even say this at the beginning. Maybe I should have like put out my take on the Yu-Gi-Oh versus Pokemon, which game is harder statement. Yu-Gi-Oh is definitely like the more complex of the two games, but Yu-Gi-Oh is also more complex than chess, but I don't think anyone would argue to be the best chess player in the world is easier than being the best Yu-Gi-Oh player in the world, right? So there's no interaction during your opponent's turn in chess either, right? Between Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, I really don't care which one is harder, and I don't really think about it ever. I always think that's like always the funny one that people bring up though, is that, because you can interact during your opponent's turn in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's the harder game. It's like, I don't know. I think you could that's immediately just disproven with chess. Like, right? You just look at chess and it's like, all right, well, it's disproven. Pokemon, there's no interaction, but like chess, everything is just like preemptive. You're just preparing for every turn after this turn with every action and every decision you make, trying to guess what you think your opponent's going to do and putting yourself in the best situation to prepare for it as much as possible, while building out your board or your options to give you the most amount of options possible, or to increase your odds as much as possible of being able to pull off like one set strategy moving forward, depending on the scenario. And everything is like, and of course, like unlike chess and Pokemon, there's randomness, right? So when you play your research, you discard your hand, you draw 7 cards, you draw in 7 random cards. You maybe had an idea of what you wanted to do when you played, before you played the research, but depending on what you draw, that might not be available to you. Now you have to adjust and come up with something new, while still trying to keep in mind all the things that you're trying to play around on your opponent's side, not give your opponent as many options as they, try to limit your opponent's options, or not give them like a direct win condition potentially as well. So I would say the lack of interaction, I don't think takes away from the depth of the Pokemon TCG. It's just different.
I think it's two different skill sets, I feel like, because it's like you said, if you're making the comparison to chess, right, you're trying to do your best to predict your opponent's move because you can't interact on their turn, right? That would be like if you could at any point take your queen and during their turn, they're going to like touch a piece. You're like, I'm going to put my queen right here, and like checkmate them or something. That wouldn't make any sense. Yeah. So when it comes to Pokemon, you're having to think several turns in advance of like the way the game is going to progress, right? And as the information slowly unveils in front of you, you're having to do what you can on your turn, because just because you're not interacting on the opponent's turn doesn't mean there isn't interaction, right?
Exactly.
And you do have other ways to interact with the opponent aside from just hitting in with your Pokemon into their Pokemon to like try to knock them out, right? Because you mentioned like Iono, right? Iona is a way to actively take apart their hand potentially and disrupt whatever strategy they've slowly been accumulating over the past couple turns. So there are several ways to interact, but just because there isn't reciprocal, like same turn interaction, which a lot of people might be used to with Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! And other similar games, there's still a layered degree of interaction, but I think it just unfolds in a much different way.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. It's definitely just like a different... it just plays out differently, and it's a little bit harder to recognize when you initially start playing Pokemon, because Pokemon, I think, is like deceptively more forgiving than something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or basically any other card game, to be honest. Pokemon's like deceptively more forgiving, but when you start playing against better and better players, the game becomes less and less forgiving. The better your opponent plays, the less forgiving the game actually becomes. So it's really hard to the idea of even trying to ask that question, I think, is always a little bit silly, of which game is harder. It doesn't really matter, of course. I think everyone would agree it doesn't really matter, but also it's impossible to ever judge which game is like harder to be the top of. But I would say, with that in mind though, for sure, is that like any tier 1 Pokemon player and any tier 1 Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, I think, could become a tier 1 on the other. I don't think neither game is complex enough to ever like prevent that from happening. Like if you're just good at strategy games and you know how to apply yourself, which you do, if you are tier 1 in either of your games, you could definitely go to the other one and become a tier 1 player. Like basically anyone in any card game, One Piece, Magic, doesn't really matter. I think and the only strategy game that I think that's not possible with is like chess. Like literally, if you're not playing chess from when you're 2 years old, you probably can't become like the world champion in chess. But for
no, Azul, you're the Pokemon person. You have to defend Pokemon to your grave. Everyone in the comments will say so.
No, I think it can go pretty much any way on this one.
I'm just messing with you. But yeah, no, it's I think over time, especially like when you first get into one game or the other, like that is definitely an argument that comes up all the time, where there's so much interaction, which is sort of at the detriment to Yu-Gi-Oh! At the same time, right? Because I would say a lot of people like Pokemon, and by extension other card games, Magic and these other games that escalate the complexity over the course of several turns, is because you don't have to do everything balls to the wall turn 1, otherwise you're dead, right? And for some people, they don't want that experience. Some people want this more streamlined sort of, okay, I'm going to do something, you do something. There is this degree of back and forth, but it unveils at a much slower rate than what Yu-Gi-Oh! Players might be used to. Like with Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's just like extreme dopamine, like I said, like fighting game. You're going like to 11 from the very first turn. And I think that is what is one of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s strengths, but simultaneously one of its weaknesses, because I think the detriment of having the interaction during both players' turns, especially now with how the game has sort of evolved, is that we talked about how Pokemon is so new player friendly and it's really easy for a lot of people to pick up and play, the easy to play, hard to master. I think the fact that you can interact only on your own turn is really helpful for people who are getting into a new game, because again, we're chunking this information and we're chunking the amount of plays you're allowed to do at any given moment, because you know you can only play on your turn, and when it's your opponent's turn, they can only play on their turn. Whereas with Yu-Gi-Oh!, and this wasn't the case in earlier Yu-Gi-Oh! I would say earlier Yu-Gi-Oh! Definitely was more like this, because we didn't have a lot of these ways to interact with the opponents on the very first turn of the game going second. With Yu-Gi-Oh!, as soon as you start, if you lose the die roll and your opponent chooses to go first, you are still actively part of this game, because if you open ways to interact with the opponent, you immediately have to start thinking, okay, where am I going to find my way to interact with them to slow them down so that way I can make my counterattack on my next turn, right? So that's just like yet another barrier that's being put into place that can make it really difficult for some people to get into the game, because there's just like so much they have to account for already with their own deck, their own cards. But now all of a sudden that you really have to, and obviously when you get to the higher level, you need to care about your opponent's stuff. I'm not saying that's something that's completely disregarded, but my point is, from like someone who's just getting into the game, or who might be like an average player looking to get better, the fact that now you have to know basically every single thing about everything your opponent's doing, in addition to everything you know about your own stuff, I think that's just like a huge barrier that's really tough for a lot of people to get into.
Yeah, and actually, like, it makes me wonder. I think there's a lot of. I think Pokemon is actually the best, like, it's the easiest game to get into, but also just like the improvements they made to the circuit and everything. The last couple of years have been like so good. I think if you took that model and applied it to like any of the other, like Yu-Gi-Oh is already still like super big, but if you had like the Pokemon structure, it could be huge. Like, it's already huge, but like if you took everything that Pokemon's doing for like their tournament structure and everything, applied it to like any other game, I feel like that would be so much better. For like any other game would be so much bigger than it already is. Because I feel like Pokemon is at the forefront of like their, you know, I guess, like, you know, helping the community and giving the community the tools they need to compete and like play and like showcase it in a way that is like just makes everything more available to growing the game, for sure. So yeah, it's like the easiest game to get into, and then like the TPCI is like making all the right moves into like trying to get the competitive scene as big as possible as well. So it's like everything's going in the right direction. So it's like kind of like sad when I look at, I hear people talk about like Yu-Gi-Oh specifically as one of the ones, and like the comparison, I'm like, man, that sounds terrible. Like, that sounds awful. Like, that's what you guys are working with. I mean, obviously you still guys have huge numbers. You said what, there's 2,600 players and what's it called? So like the game is still huge, but like it seems like there's like so much more potential there. If there was more invested from the tournament organizers and stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's interesting though, because you would think if that were the primary motivator, that would reflect in the player counts of us breaking records and such, but it's not. And I really think that Yu-Gi-Oh just has, you know, it's you know, sticky little tendrils just dug deep into so many players. I don't know if it's nostalgia. I don't know if it's the fact that the way that the game plays, it's just such a dopamine rush, because I think that's one thing that really people love so much about the game, is that it is so exhilarating from the very first turn, because each individual card is just so powerful that at any point you're kind of on edge, because you know that you can just die at any moment if you don't make the right play. And again, whether that's a good or a bad thing is obviously up for everyone watching this to decide, but that is what Yu-Gi-Oh has leaned into over the past several years, and that's what people really like about the game. Funny enough, that has also sort of sprung up the rise of like the retro Yu-Gi-Oh formats. I'm talking about like Edison format for anyone watching, for people who want that more older style of Yu-Gi-Oh that has the ability to, you know, do these like fun little combos, but you're not spending, you know, a million minutes on your first turn trying to like go and sequence through 70, 80 cards to do whatever it is you're trying to do, right? It's very much like Pokemon in a lot of ways, where there is a lot of back and forth between the games. The only real interaction that's occurring is with trap cards, so that's hidden information that's available for you to see. Like, okay, there's a face down card. There's only a handful of cards in this format, so like, what can it be? What can I play around? And it's very indicative of like an older style card game. And these tournaments have been capping out, if not going over capacity, every single time there's a large YCS at the same venue at 200, 300, 400. I think at Nationals last year, we had a 400 or 500 person Edison tournament, which was like one of the biggest ever. And so it's interesting seeing that split. But at the same time, the player counts for actual, you know, current advanced Yu-Gi-Oh keep breaking records, and that's incredible to see. So it's interesting because I agree with you that if Konami took the Pokemon Company's model and just ran with it, that could be even more beneficial to the game. But at the same time, if everything's still looking good, when it comes to numbers, when it comes to view counts, when these tournaments are taking place, I'm pretty sure at one point I saw at the last YCS, there was like 30,000 people watching like the finals or something like that. It was like crazy numbers. Clearly there's something there, and I don't know what it is. I mean, maybe we're just, at the end of the day, we just all love playing card games. So I guess that's something we could all agree on.
Yeah, maybe it's just in general across the board. Everyone just like is getting into, I don't know, maybe it's card games in general across the board. People are getting into them more because like Pokemon is having a huge surgence, and like we're getting what's nice is that we're getting the response from TBCI in terms of everything as far as that goes. Yeah, I feel like whenever I hear from other card games, they're still doing well, of course, right? Like record numbers and Yu-Gi-Oh, like you mentioned, and I don't know where One Piece is at right now, but it feels like no one is giving the attention. The tournament organizer side is no one's giving them the games the attention the way TPCI is right now. So it kind of, I always like mention that it feels like that kind of sucks for like the other games. I feel like TPCI has not always been like this. So like, but the most recent years, like getting this kind of attention from them to the community has felt really nice. I just like wish the best for everyone else out there. So but yeah, if it's working without it, then that's good as well. But yeah, having all the games exist and thrive in the long term is always going to be the goal. So it'd be good to see.
Of course. And I know the whole, thesis of this discussion was sort of spiraling around, which of the two games is necessarily harder. Just because one game is harder than the other, depending on which perspective you have at the end of this discussion, doesn't necessarily mean one game is better than the other, right? I think you and I can both agree that different people look for different experiences out of their card games. And so that's why some are attracted to Yu-Gi-Oh!, some are attracted to Pokemon, some are attracted to the myriad of different card games that are available on the market. Yeah, of course, the big three are always going to be the big three, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for innovation and improvement for any other games to come along. But I think at the end of the day, that people just, like just playing cards and sitting across from someone who shares that similar experience.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. They're just different, and they're just different in terms of that stuff. It's impossible to calculate which one is harder, and it's not worth putting the time or effort in. Which maybe some Yu-Gi-Oh players will take as me just trying to brush off the argument to just try and distract from the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh is harder. Yu-Gi-Oh is definitely the more complex game. It's harder to learn. But at the highest level of things, it's impossible to tell which game is actually like truly hardest to master. And it's not worth putting the time into. I think we always have the benchmark is chess for strategy games. You can always look at chess and be like, that is the hardest game that exists to master, to my knowledge at least. There might be something harder out there, but there's not enough, people have put the time into it to actually try and push it to its limit. So chess is always going to be the benchmark. But as far as the card games go, yeah, like I said, I think you could take any tier 1 or even like past tier 1, any tier S player from any game could go to a different game and become at least a tier. They could at least top cut a major, probably within a year or less, no problem.
You could definitely take those skills and apply them to any game. And it's interesting because you say that how, Yu-Gi-Oh is the more complex game, but is it complex for the right reasons, right? Because as we've gone through this discussion, right, I think you would agree with me that a lot of the things that I've been describing are these like artificial complexity barriers that are just there because of the way that the game is designed that are unnecessarily making the game more complicated before you even get to the game itself, right? When it comes to just the amount of like different things you have to do prior to even sitting down to playing a game with another person. And it's funny because I think when Yu-Gi-Oh players jump to Pokemon, there's this stark contrast of, oh my God, this is it. And they say this is it, not in a, condescending way, but in a sense that they're so conditioned by how Yu-Gi-Oh is just so much to front load at once. It's almost refreshing in a lot of ways because they can just apply all of their critical thinking to the actual game itself, and they can just really focus and hone in on that and not have to worry about all of this random bullshit about like all these, like you said earlier on about how you thought a card would interact in one way and it doesn't. I'm not sure if that happens in Pokemon very frequently or if at all for that matter.
Not very often, no. It's basically
right, exactly. But Yu-Gi-Oh has a lot of that. There's so many times where I've sat across from an opponent and they try to do a play and they say, or I tell them like, oh, I'm sorry, like that's not how that works. And then you're kind of the bad guy as a result of that. And then, but I don't know why Yu-Gi-Oh has that issue, but it just kind of comes down to the way the game is fundamentally designed. And so it's unfortunate that there's all these like artificial complexity barriers in place. That's what I mean when it's like, yeah, if Yu-Gi-Oh is more complex or more difficult, is it for the right reasons at the end of the day? And I think that's definitely a question that still lingers in a lot of people's minds.
I definitely had like that's actually funny that you mentioned that. A long time ago, I don't remember what it was like some podcast or something with some fighting game players. They were talking about different games, and like, I forget how he said it, but I think it was like a Melee player or something. He was just like, a game being more complex does not make it better or like more skillful. And I forget how he exactly broke it down, but that's basically what he was trying to say is like, just like if you just make things harder, if you have to press 4 buttons for one button press, it doesn't necessarily make things more skillful, right? If you just increase the amount of button presses to confirm a combo or an action, all of a sudden you have no time to think. Now you can't strategize, and now you're only pressing buttons and hoping that you press the right buttons. And now you can't strategize in terms of, picking the correct choice. You just have to do some choice, right? So it's a little bit different in something like a card game because you have more time to like think through your process, obviously. But that's something that's actually stuck with me for a little while. So whenever I discuss this, what like a quote that I use is like, it's something more complex doesn't actually just make it better. Complexity doesn't equal better for that. I've always taken that with me.
You can even make the argument with Pokemon that because it has such an easy barrier for people to enter the game, that a lot of people are on a more even footing. The ceiling for how well you can do, especially at the top tiers of competitive Pokemon, to be like in your echelon, for instance. Everyone, there isn't all of these random roadblocks that you have to like kind of run head first into to like learn about that. It's kind of like what you were saying with your analogy with the fighting game stuff. It's like adding the extra buttons doesn't necessarily add skill. Like, is that, I don't think that's skill expression, right? That's just like artificial difficulty for no reason. Which is funny because I feel like a lot of fighting games are trying to experiment with like moving away from that, but I think that's like a whole nother discussion altogether.
Or something I wanted to put out there so people like truly can like understand where I'm coming from with all this discussion and thought as well. Like I said, I don't really care. And for people who are saying, if the best Yu-Gi-Oh players come over to Pokemon, best Magic players, whatever, they'll top 8. I think that would be sick. I think it would be great if the top 8 Yu-Gi-Oh players come to, I mean, whatever. I don't know. I forget his name. I actually liked one of his tweets earlier, but he said he's going to go to Atlanta Regionals in Pokemon. But yeah, if the top 8 Yu-Gi-Oh players come to Atlanta Regionals and they all make top 8 at Pokemon, that would be sick. Where I'm at in my career, I mean, I'd obviously want to win Pokemon Worlds, but this is something I've been saying recently. I'm excited for the future of the competitive landscape of the Pokemon TCG. And if the top 8 Yu-Gi-Oh players came to the Atlanta Regional Championships and all made top 8, that would be sick, because that means the ceiling in the Pokemon TCG is so much higher than we previously thought. That's what I would be excited for. It'd be like, oh my gosh, like the Pokemon TCG is just like so much harder than, there's so much more to the game than I had originally thought. Because like if that actually happened, that would just be absurd, right? The chance that happened. So yeah, I'm excited for the future of the Pokemon TCG. So we have players like Kamal coming over and getting like top 8 last season, and he's like a Yu-Gi-Oh player, right? And then if more Yu-Gi-Oh players and One Piece players, I know Cross from One Piece, he's been coming to some Pokemon regionals. I'm excited for the future of the landscape of the Pokemon TCG. So if the good players from other card games want to come over and play and try and win, I'm all for it. Like, I want to see that happen. I want to see them succeed. So I'm down.
Yeah, and it's like a perfect anecdote for that was, granted it wasn't as on a large scale, but I told you there are these like smaller, retro format Edison tournaments that also take place at our YCSs. And one of the more recent ones, I believe second place at this event, which was actually taken by a Pokemon player. As a matter of fact, he even said in his deck profile, he's like, just for the record, I'm not a Yu-Gi-Oh player. He's like, I play Pokemon and One Piece, but my friends, like, I wanted to try this out. My friends, like, helped me out. And so he applied, all that knowledge to our format and ended up, getting second, which is fantastic. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's awesome that if we would see that sort of like, crossover of play. And then, I think it only just makes the competition better because now you have people with different backgrounds and skill sets trying to apply them to a completely different game, probably getting rewarded for it better too, but I didn't hear that from me. And I just think that would rock. I remember like when I saw Kamal in one of the Pokemon series, I'm like, oh, that's sick. Like, that's cool. Cause it's like, in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, like we know some of these people who are just like really good at the game. So it's, I think it's great. And I agree with you. I think we have we're definitely in like, you know, a golden age of sorts where it just seems like player counts are exploding. It seems like things are just like only really going up for a lot of these games, and hopefully that's just continues to be the case.
Yeah, hopefully both sides. Yeah, and we don't have any air fryers over here as well. Confirmed, no air fryers.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. I knew you were waiting to get that in. But Azul, thank you so much for joining me in our discussion. For anyone who watched it this far, thank you so much as well. Go down to the comments and fight as to if Yu-Gi-Oh is better than Pokemon or vice versa, because we want to see you all just, you know, go off and just murder each other in cold blood over your favorite card game. But no, seriously, this is a lot of fun. I'm glad we just got to talk about our card games and just yap about the things that we love about them, because I think when we were seeing all the discourse on Twitter, I just thought this would be a fun discussion just to share the similarities and differences between our games and what makes them so great. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Azul. Truly.
Yeah, of course, I had fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And everyone wish him the best of luck at Worlds. And we're going to soon be speaking to the next world champion in Pokemon.
Hopefully. Maybe that'll be my true retirement will be that. We'll see.
For all the Yu-Gi-Oh people who watch my content, just out of curiosity, how much do you get for winning Worlds out of curiosity?
In Pokemon? Man, I don't even remember. They upped it. It might be 50K now. It might be 50K.
Oh, that's all?
Yeah, I think it might be. I actually don't remember. They did yeah, no, it is, because it was 25 in the past. I think they doubled their prize pool like 2 years ago, so it should be 50.
Oh, they just doubled it.
They doubled everything across the board.
All right, YCS Air Fryer coming to a town near you soon. But guys, thank you so much for watching. Go subscribe to Azul. I'll have his info down in the description, and we will see you next time. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for another video. I really hope you all enjoyed. Let's go ahead and shout the patrons for all of their continued support. So shout outs to Shout1317, Tim00x3, MBT Play Medolce, Moto, Cameron L. Smith, The Synchro Guy, Pony Stark, Dan the Man Hoban, Little Fadeleaf, Draconic, Dylan Rare Hunter, JW11860, Flannel Daddy, literally all of the guinea pigs, Cheeks McLapperty, Stolfin Amethyst, MBT Cancel Bio Community soon, Cancel Bio Committee soon, Cancel Bio Player soon, Wonder Waffle, MBT and Nimnims, One Boxer Brief Fueled Knight of Passion, Daniel Howell, Electrician of the Ice Barrier, Astro Random, Arco, and the Nova 129. Thank you guys so much again for watching, and we will see you next time.